Imagine a machine that feels alive beneath you, one that growls in defiance of limits, every movement calibrated, every response immediate, as if steel and adrenaline have fused into instinct. Picture a shape so iconic that even a silhouette can send enthusiasts spiraling into nostalgia. It's more than speed, it's the sensation of control, of mastery, of engineering turned into emotion. Yet behind the legend lies a story of boundaries broken, of laws bent, of a passion so strong it couldn't be contained by regulation or reason. What happens when a car meant to embody perfection ends up rewriting the rules of what's legal, what's possible, and what's unforgettable? This is the kind of story that reminds us why we fall in love with machines in the first place, because they reflect our desire to chase the unattainable. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which forbidden machine you want to see next. The Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaizo wasn't supposed to exist in America, at least not in the way it did. Born at the turn of the millennium, the R34 was Japan's apex predator, a finely tuned, computer-aided, all-wheel drive masterpiece that represented the peak of analog meets digital performance. It was faster, sharper, and more intelligent than nearly anything on the road. But when American enthusiasts saw it tearing through the streets of Tokyo in magazines, DVDs, and eventually on movie screens, they were struck by a painful truth. It wasn't legal here. Federal regulations kept it locked away, out of reach, forbidden fruit for a generation that grew up worshiping its badge. That was the spark that gave birth to the Kaizo story, a bold attempt to bring the R34 to US soil, even if it meant bending the rules that defined what a car could legally be. To understand the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaizo, we have to rewind to the end of Japan's economic bubble and the height of the tuning era. The late 1990s were a time when Japanese automakers, still buzzing from dominance in Group A racing and rally, were pouring innovation into street cars that could embarrass European exotics. The R34 emerged as the culmination of that momentum, a car born from competition, refined through precision, and engineered to deliver consistency over chaos. Nissan's engineers built it with purpose, a twin-turbo inline-six engine codenamed RB26 Diet, paired with an Atisa ETS Pro all-wheel drive system that could dynamically send power where it was needed most. Layered on top was Super Hikus four-wheel steering and a chassis rigid enough to absorb both circuit abuse and backroad punishment. In Japan, it was a statement, proof that technology and driving purity could coexist. But across the Pacific, the R34 Skyline was something different. It was a ghost, an icon seen but never touched. The US government's 25-year import rule made it virtually impossible to own one legally before 2024, and Nissan never certified it for American safety or emissions standards. That left a vacuum. Fans wanted it. The system forbade it. And where there's demand, there's always someone willing to find a loophole. Enter Kaizo Industries, a small company that saw an opportunity buried in the fine print. Their idea was deceptively simple. If you can't import a car as a whole, import it as parts. A bare chassis here, an engine separately, components declared as auto parts, and then reassembled in the US under a new VIN. Legally, it wasn't a Nissan Skyline GT-R anymore. On paper, it was a kit car. In reality, it was everything enthusiasts dreamed of, just with a different identity. The Kaizo-built R34s weren't replicas or fakes. They were genuine GT-Rs reborn under a technical loophole. And because they were assembled locally, owners could, at least for a while, register and drive them. The idea exploded in underground circles, turning Kaizo into a whispered legend among import fans. Each car represented defiance, a middle finger to bureaucracy wrapped in silver paint and twin turbos. For many, the Kaizo Skyline wasn't just a machine. It was a declaration of freedom. It said that love for a car could be powerful enough to outmaneuver red tape. Then Hollywood came calling. When Too Fast, Too Furious began production, the studio wanted something that embodied the franchise's new obsession, global tuning culture. They found it in a Kaizo-built R34 Skyline GT-R, finished in silver with blue stripes, a car that would become Brian O'Connor's on-screen masterpiece. That single decision cemented the R34's myth in American pop culture. Millions of moviegoers saw it race across Florida's highways and fell instantly in love. It wasn't just fast, it was untouchable, a visual metaphor for the forbidden car Americans could never have. What few realized, though, was that the car they were watching was technically illegal the moment it rolled onto US soil. Behind the scenes, Kaizo's operations were both clever and fragile. The company walked a thin line between compliance and violation. They didn't import cars, they claimed. They imported chassis and every other component separately. But when customs and regulatory agencies began to investigate, it became clear that the cars were too complete, too finished, too obviously Skylines. The US government saw it as a smuggling operation dressed up as paperwork. By 2009, the hammer fell. Homeland Security seized multiple Kaizo R34s, including one believed to be the very car from Too Fast, Too Furious. Owners across the country suddenly found their dream machines impounded, their registrations revoked. What was once a symbol of passion became a target of enforcement. Still, the legend only grew. The very act of banning the Kaizo Skyline GTR R34 gave it more power, transforming it from an imported sports car into an outlaw folk hero. For enthusiasts, it represented the eternal tug-of-war between creativity and control, between what's right and what's allowed. Even as the seizures made headlines, people still whispered about Kaizo cars in forums and meets, trading VINs, photos, and serial numbers like secret codes. The R34 became more than a vehicle. It became a rebellion on wheels. That's the paradox of the Nissan Skyline GTR R34 Kaizo. It was built not just to drive, but to exist where it shouldn't, to push against the edges of legality and claim space in a system that said no. Its story begins with ingenuity, grows through obsession, and inevitably collides with authority. But the end of that collision isn't the end of the legend, it's where the myth deepens. Because once a car becomes illegal, it also becomes immortal. The next part of this story isn't about how the Skyline came to America. It's about what happened once it was here. How the Kaizo R34 became a symbol, a movie star, and a cautionary tale all at once. The Nissan Skyline GTR R34. Kaizo's fame didn't just come from the movies, it came from the myth that surrounded it. When the silver and blue Kaizo R34 appeared on screen in Too Fast, Too Furious, it wasn't simply another tuner car. It was an outlaw, a cinematic symbol of the forbidden. Overnight, the car became one of the most recognizable vehicles in the franchise, right alongside the Dodge Charger and Toyota Supra. For millions of fans, that R34 was the moment Japanese performance cars reached the heart of American pop culture. But behind the scenes, the attention brought danger. The very same exposure that made the Kaizo R34 famous also painted a target on its back, drawing scrutiny from federal authorities who now knew exactly what to look for. To understand the second life of the Nissan Skyline GTR R34 Kaizo, you have to understand timing. In the early 2000s, America's tuning culture was exploding. Magazines, DVDs, and online forums were spreading faster than regulation could catch up. The car scene wasn't mainstream yet. It was still seen as underground, raw, and often misunderstood. When the Kaizo loophole emerged, it was seen as a gift. For the first time, enthusiasts could import their dream machine legally, or so they thought. Kaizo's interpretation of import law allowed for chassis shipments, which were then rebuilt in the US and assigned new VIN numbers. The cars passed state inspections because, technically, they weren't Skylines anymore. They were kit cars assembled from imported parts. The system wasn't airtight, but for several years, it worked. Then came the shift. US Customs, the Department of Transportation, and the Environmental Protection Agency all began cross-checking Kaizo VINs. When officials realized the vehicles being registered as kit cars were actually complete Nissan Skyline GTR R34s, they saw it as a deliberate end run around federal law. Homeland Security took over the investigation, targeting both Kaizo industries and private owners. In 2009, raids were conducted, cars were confiscated, and owners faced impossible choices: surrender their vehicles or face potential prosecution. Some complied. Others hid their cars, tucked away in garages, stripped to bare shells to avoid seizure. For the first time in modern automotive culture, owning the wrong car wasn't just a fine, it was a criminal risk. Yet even as the crackdown spread, the legend of the Kaizo R34 deepened. The seized cars became trophies of a lost cause. The few that escaped became unicorns. Car forums lit up with VIN databases, grainy photos, and stories of ghost R34s hidden somewhere in California or Texas. The outlaw status gave the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaizo a mystique no marketing campaign could ever buy. The car had become untouchable, both in desirability and in danger. Enthusiasts whispered about it in the same tone people reserved for rare Ferraris or banned weapons. It was beautiful, powerful, and forbidden, but that fame had a cultural side effect. Suddenly, the Kaizo R34 wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of defiance. It represented a generation of enthusiasts tired of bureaucracy deciding what they could drive. Its story inspired YouTubers, tuners, and importers who looked for new loopholes, some legal, some not. The Kaizo controversy even helped shape the movement that later pushed for legalizing certain Japanese classics under the show or display exemption, which allowed limited use of historically significant cars not originally sold in the US. In a strange way, the same government pressure that tried to erase the Kaizo cars ended up opening new pathways for future imports. Still, the cultural high point of the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaizo came through its role in shaping media and perception. Before Too Fast, Too Furious, most American audiences had no idea what a Skyline was. Afterward, it became the car every teenager could name. The Kaizo car, with its gleaming body and twin-turbo soundtrack, became shorthand for an entire lifestyle, the pursuit of something just beyond reach. Even the franchise's later films nodded back to that first R34, reinforcing its mythical place in the series' DNA. It wasn't just a movie prop anymore, it was an artifact of rebellion, preserved on screen for eternity. What makes the Kaizo R34's story so fascinating isn't just the car itself. It's the clash between passion and policy. On one side, engineers and fans devoted to preserving Japan's performance heritage. On the other, agencies tasked with keeping America's roads compliant and safe. Both had legitimate motives. But somewhere in the middle stood the Kaizo Skyline, a physical manifestation of that conflict. It wasn't built to cheat the system. It was built because the system left enthusiasts no other choice. The car existed because of love, not law. By the early 2010s, the Kaizo name faded from headlines, but its influence didn't. The seized Skylines disappeared into storage or were destroyed under government order, but the images remained online. Videos of the Kaizo R34 ripping down Florida highways in Too Fast, Too Furious replayed endlessly on YouTube, gaining new generations of fans who had no idea of the car's complicated past. Some believe the original movie car still existed, hidden in a private collection under tight secrecy. Others claim to have seen it restored and displayed overseas. The truth remains murky, but that ambiguity only strengthens its legend. Through it all, one fact remains undeniable. The Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaizo redefined what it meant for a car to be desirable. It wasn't just fast, it was forbidden, and that made it immortal. Every crackdown, every headline, every confiscation only amplified the myth. It became proof that when a machine captures enough hearts, it can survive even the full weight of legality crashing down on it. The next chapter isn't about the Kaizo operation or the seizures. It's about what the R34's legacy became after the smoke cleared, and why, decades later, its story still drives the soul of car culture today. The Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaizo may have been outlawed, but its spirit never died. In fact, what came after the raids was arguably more powerful than the car itself, a movement built on nostalgia, resilience, and the unrelenting will of enthusiasts to keep a dream alive. Once the seizures made headlines, the story of the Kaizo R34 transcended the car scene. It became a parable about ingenuity versus authority, a reminder that innovation often blooms in the margins. What started as a technical workaround evolved into cultural rebellion. The car that broke the rules ended up rewriting them. When people talk about the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaizo today, they're not just recalling a single vehicle, they're recalling a shift in the entire landscape of automotive passion. For years, the R34 was a digital legend. It lived in video games, movies, and posters, but few had seen one in person. The Kaizo era changed that. It gave physical form to fantasy. For a brief window in the mid-2000s, Americans could stand next to a living, breathing Skyline, even if it wasn't supposed to be here. That fleeting access left a permanent mark. To the generation that grew up watching Too Fast, Too Furious, the Kaizo R34 wasn't just a car, it was the physical embodiment of the impossible becoming real. After the dust settled, the legal landscape began to shift. The crackdown on Kaizo cars had exposed how outdated US import regulations were, particularly the infamous 25-year rule. Enthusiasts argued that cars like the R34 represented cultural heritage, not just horsepower. Lawmakers listened, slowly. In the following decade, small reforms and exemptions began to appear. The show or display rule gave collectors limited options to legally own cars that were once off limits, as long as they weren't driven excessively. And as the years passed, the R34 inched closer to the magic 25-year mark, meaning full legal importation would soon be possible. Ironically, the very controversy that destroyed Kaizo's business also helped pave the way for the Skyline's eventual legalization. Meanwhile, the Kaizo R34's image continued to evolve. It became a touchstone for conversations about authenticity in car culture. Was a Kaizo Skyline real if it had a new VIN and was technically a kit car? Purists debated endlessly, but enthusiasts knew the truth, it didn't matter. The experience behind the wheel, the turbo spool, the AWD grip, the RB26 scream, was identical. Kaizo cars might have lived in legal limbo, but their emotional impact was 100% genuine. For owners, driving one wasn't about defying the government. It was about connecting to something transcendent, something mechanical yet deeply human. Over time, the surviving Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaizo builds became prized artifacts. Some were quietly reassembled overseas. Others resurfaced in private American collections, carefully maintained but rarely shown. A few slipped into museums under display-only status, their plates removed, their stories whispered by curators who knew their significance. These cars now exist in a strange space, half legend, half evidence. They represent a chapter of automotive history where passion outpaced permission, and innovation tiptoed around regulation. Beyond the car community, the Kaizo story continues to resonate because it mirrors the spirit of every enthusiast who's ever wanted something the system said they couldn't have. It's about curiosity, risk, and creativity, the same forces that push engineers to design better machines and fans to chase perfection. And in an era where cars are increasingly digital, automated, and sanitized, the raw defiance of the Kaizo R34 feels more important than ever. It reminds us of a time when people built, tuned, and fought for their dreams, one bolt at a time. Today, the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaizo stands as both cautionary tale and cultural monument. It warns against cutting corners, but also celebrates those bold enough to think differently. Its DNA can be found in every import shop that fights to keep old engines alive, in every petition for fairer automotive laws, in every enthusiast who refuses to settle for close enough. Even now, as fully legal R34s trickle into the US under the 25-year rule, their arrival feels like the closing of a long, cinematic loop, the story that began with Kaizo finally finding redemption. The outlaw became the icon. The loophole became the legacy. And in the end, the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34, Kaizo proved that passion isn't just what drives a car, it's what drives a culture. But there's still one more chapter to this saga, the part that affects anyone thinking about buying, owning or preserving an R34 today, and what lessons the Kaizo story offers for the future of car culture in America. For anyone chasing the dream of owning a Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaizo, or even a fully legal R34 today, the first reality check is that desire always outpaces availability. These cars were never mass imports. The Kaizo builds were rare from the start, and the legitimate R34s now entering under the 25-year rule are scarcer still. Prices reflect that scarcity. While a base R34 GT-R once cost under $90,000 in Japan, clean examples now command well over $250,000 in the US, with special editions like the V-Spec Tuner easily doubling that. A genuine Kaizo car, with its outlaw provenance and cinematic ties, is nearly priceless. When one appears, it moves quietly through private sales, often with confidentiality agreements attached. The irony is thick. A car once seized for being too illegal to own has become one of the most valuable imports on American soil. The Nissan Skyline GT-R R34. Kaizo also carries a cautionary legacy for today's enthusiasts. Importing or modifying cars remains a legal minefield, and the Kaizo case is a reminder that passion doesn't excuse ignorance. Anyone looking to bring in a JDM classic must understand the fine print. EPA compliance, DOT standards, and the difference between a show car exemption and a street-legal title. Even small oversights can turn a six-figure investment into a seized asset. The best path forward for American fans is patience. With R34s now reaching eligibility under federal law, legitimate importers can finally offer the real deal, complete with paperwork, emissions compliance, and peace of mind. Yet despite the legal risks of the past, there's an emotional purity to the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaizo story that continues to inspire new builders. It's proof that enthusiasm isn't about ownership, it's about obsession, craft, and connection. The Kaizo era showed that car culture thrives on creativity. It's what drove people to engineer solutions, to learn the law, to challenge it when necessary, and to build anyway. Even if their creations were later impounded, the spirit behind them didn't fade. You can see echoes of it in today's EV swaps, resto mod projects, and home-built track cars, modern descendants of the same rebellious DNA that once powered those hand-assembled Skylines. For collectors, the legacy of the Kaizo R34 carries both opportunity and responsibility.
Owning one means stewarding a piece of history that exists between legality and legend.
The cars that survived are tangible reminders of how car culture pushes back against restriction, how passion often finds a way to exist even when it's told it can't. And for those who grew up, idolizing that silver and blue Skyline on screen, finally seeing an R34 on American roads feels like a generational victory. The car that once symbolized never now represents finally. The Nissan Skyline GT-R R34. Kaizo's impact goes beyond horsepower figures or lap times. It redefined what it means to love a machine. It taught enthusiasts to question, to learn, to persevere. It reminded regulators that enthusiasm isn't a threat, it's a form of preservation. And it inspired an entire subculture to fight for access, to build communities, and to turn rebellion into reform. The Kaizo R34's journey from loophole to legend isn't just a chapter in tuner history, it's a blueprint for what comes next. Because every time someone fights to import, restore, or protect a car they love, they're continuing that same legacy of defiant creativity. The outlaw car became the teacher. The seized engine became a symbol. And the dream once banned now rides legally down American highways. That's the lasting truth of the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaizo, proof that sometimes the road to legitimacy begins with a little rebellion.